While the Federal Reserve tried to project calm, a devastating inflation report just exposed how Trump's tariff war is systematically destroying American purchasing power. And the hidden data reveals that what you're paying at the store is just the beginning of an economic catastrophe that could make the 1970s stagflation look like a minor inconvenience. Let's begin. The economic deception you've been sensing has finally been laid bare in Tuesday's Consumer Price Index report, where government statisticians revealed that American families are experiencing a coordinated assault on their standard of living disguised as trade policy victory. What appears to be moderate inflation at 2.7% annually is actually masking the early stages of a price explosion that economists privately warn could reshape American consumer behavior for a generation. The Bureau of Labor Statistics data released Tuesday shows consumer prices rose 0.2% in July, maintaining the 2.7% annual rate that officials are celebrating as evidence of economic stability. But this surface-level calm conceals a more sinister reality. Trump's tariff policies are systematically transferring wealth from American consumers to the federal treasury through a hidden tax system that most families don't even realize they're paying. The foundation of this economic deception lies in what trade economists call tariff transmission lag. The gap between when import duties are imposed and when they fully appear in consumer prices. Companies have been absorbing massive tariff costs for months to maintain market share, but that absorption capacity is reaching its breaking point. What you're seeing in Tuesday's data represents the early stages of a price adjustment that could accelerate dramatically in coming months. The timing of this revelation couldn't be more critical for American households already struggling with housing costs, healthcare expenses, and wage stagnation. The Federal Reserve's preferred inflation measure suggests that price pressures will intensify throughout the remainder of 2025, potentially forcing policymakers to choose between protecting the dollar and preserving employment. By understanding what's really driving today's inflation data, you're witnessing the moment when trade policy stopped being an abstract political discussion and became a direct attack on every American family's grocery budget, clothing expenses, and basic cost of living. The strategic deception you now comprehend has created perfect conditions for what consumer economists are calling stealth stagflation, a scenario where official statistics understate the true impact of policy-driven price increases, while economic growth simultaneously weakens under the weight of reduced consumer spending power. Throughout the summer of 2025, American retailers have been engaged in a desperate balancing act that few consumers understand. Major companies like General Motors have absorbed over $1.1 billion in tariff costs during the previous quarter alone, choosing to sacrifice profits rather than immediately pass costs to customers. This corporate sacrifice has created an artificial buffer that has temporarily shielded consumers from the full impact of trade policy. But that buffer is rapidly disappearing as companies reach the limits of their ability to absorb additional costs. Walmart, Best Buy, and other major retailers have begun warning investors about inevitable price increases, while supply chain managers report unprecedented pressure to find cost savings anywhere possible. The July CPI data represents the moment when this corporate cost absorption began breaking down. The sector-by-sector breakdown reveals the systematic nature of the price assault. Apparel and footwear costs are rising as clothing manufacturers struggle with tariffs on Vietnamese and Chinese imports. Home furnishings face pressure from duties on furniture and appliances. Even basic household items like tools and toys are becoming more expensive as retailers can no longer absorb the full burden of import taxes. The geographical distribution of these price increases shows how tariff policy is creating regional economic disparities. Areas dependent on imported goods are experiencing faster inflation than regions with more domestic production, creating a patchwork of economic pressure that varies dramatically by location and income level. You've now uncovered how what appears to be moderate inflation actually represents the early stages of a systematic transfer of wealth from American consumers to government coffers, with the full impact yet to be revealed. Subscribe to our channel if you're finding our video informative. The critical revelation you've been anticipating emerged at exactly 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, when the Bureau of Labor Statistics released inflation data that didn't just confirm economists' fears, but exposed the sophisticated mechanism through which trade policy is being used to systematically extract wealth from American families while maintaining the illusion of economic stability. The headline figure of 2.7% annual inflation and 0.2% monthly increase initially appeared to validate the Trump administration's claims about maintaining price stability despite extensive tariff implementation. But deeper analysis of the data revealed something far more alarming: the emergence of what economists call selective price transmission, where tariff costs are appearing in specific categories while being masked by temporary factors in others. The most telling aspect of Tuesday's report was the divergence between goods and services inflation. While falling gasoline prices helped contain overall inflation, a broad array of manufactured goods showed accelerating price increases that directly correlate with tariff implementation timelines. Commodities excluding food and gas rose 0.2% for the second consecutive month, reversing the flat readings from earlier in the year. Diane Swank, chief economist at KPMG, captured the significance of this shift. Tariffs are now fueling inflation, causing lethargy in the labor market and further sowing the seeds of uncertainty. Her analysis reveals that the current inflation pattern shows hallmarks of tariff-driven price increases that are just beginning to work through the economic system. The apparel and footwear category provided the clearest evidence of tariff transmission. Basic clothing items like t-shirts, socks, and sneakers showed price increases that directly correspond to the timing of tariff implementation on Vietnamese and Chinese imports. These aren't luxury items where consumers can easily substitute. They represent necessities that families must purchase regardless of price. Perhaps most significantly, the shelter category, which had been showing signs of cooling from pandemic-era spikes, remained elevated at 3.7% annually. This suggests that even housing costs, traditionally insulated from trade policy, are beginning to feel indirect pressure from reduced consumer spending power as families allocate larger portions of their budgets to increasingly expensive goods. The Federal Reserve's dilemma became clear in the market reaction to Tuesday's data. While stocks initially rose on the apparently moderate inflation reading, bond markets showed more nuanced concerns about the underlying trends. The central bank now faces the impossible choice between cutting rates to support a weakening labor market or maintaining higher rates to combat accelerating goods inflation. What you're witnessing is the moment when abstract trade policy became concrete family budget pressure, with inflation data revealing that American consumers are beginning to pay the true cost of tariff warfare through permanently higher prices for basic necessities. The aftershock from Tuesday's inflation revelation has triggered a cascade of responses across American business and policy circles that expose just how unprepared the economy was for the transition from corporate cost absorption to consumer price transmission, with implications that extend far beyond the immediate statistical release. Within hours of the BLS data release, retail executives began implementing pricing strategies that had been developed in anticipation of this moment but held in reserve until corporate cost absorption reached its breaking point. Target announced strategic pricing adjustments across multiple categories, while Home Depot warned investors that home improvement costs would rise throughout the remainder of 2025 as appliance and tool tariffs work through supply chains. The Federal Reserve's response was notably restrained, with officials declining to comment directly on the inflation data, but market participants interpreting the silence as confirmation that policymakers are increasingly concerned about the trajectory of goods inflation. Money markets immediately adjusted expectations for September rate cuts, with the probability of a 0.25% reduction falling from 87% to 65%, as traders recognized the Fed's impossible position. Corporate America's reaction revealed the depth of cost pressures that had been building behind the scenes. Manufacturing companies began announcing layoffs disguised as efficiency improvements, while service sector businesses reported reduced hiring plans. The National Federation of Independent Business noted that small business optimism continued declining as owners faced the dual pressure of higher input costs and reduced consumer spending power. Perhaps most significantly, consumer behavior data from major retailers showed the early stages of demand destruction as families began modifying spending patterns in response to higher prices. Electronics purchases slowed dramatically as tariffs on components drove up costs, while clothing sales shifted toward discount retailers as families sought to maintain purchasing power. The psychological impact became visible in consumer sentiment surveys, where respondents increasingly cited inflation concerns despite the relatively moderate official statistics. This divergence between official data and consumer perception reflects the reality that families are experiencing price pressures in categories that matter most to their daily lives, even when overall statistics appear manageable. You now understand what policymakers are desperately trying to manage. The transition from hidden corporate cost absorption to visible consumer price increases that could trigger a broader reconsideration of trade policy as families begin to feel the true economic impact of tariff warfare in their daily lives. The unresolved inflation dynamics you've tracked through Tuesday's data release reveal a truth that most observers are missing. This isn't just about temporary price adjustments, but rather the emergence of a new inflation regime where trade policy permanently alters the relationship between American consumers and global markets, with consequences that could reshape economic behavior for decades. What you're witnessing is the birth of structural trade inflation, a phenomenon where protective trade policies create permanent upward pressure on consumer prices that can't be reversed without fundamental changes to trade relationships. Unlike traditional inflation cycles driven by monetary policy or demand fluctuations, trade-driven inflation requires either policy reversal or permanent adjustment to higher price levels. The timeline for this adjustment presents American families with a stark choice: accept permanently higher prices for goods ranging from clothing to electronics to household items, or reduce consumption in ways that could trigger broader economic slowdown. Economic models suggest that full tariff transmission could add 1 to 1.5% to annual inflation rates, potentially pushing consumer price growth above 4% by year-end. The international implications extend far beyond American borders into the fundamental structure of global trade relationships. If the United States successfully implements permanent tariff barriers while maintaining economic growth, it could inspire similar policies worldwide, potentially fragmenting the global economy into competing trade blocs with dramatically different price structures. For Federal Reserve policy, the emergence of trade-driven inflation represents a challenge that traditional monetary tools cannot address. Central bankers face the unprecedented situation of dealing with inflation caused by fiscal policy decisions that cannot be offset through interest rate adjustments without triggering broader economic damage. The broader implications for American competitiveness are equally profound and largely unrecognized in current policy discussions. Permanently higher consumer prices reduce purchasing power, potentially forcing changes in consumption patterns that could affect everything from housing markets to education spending to retirement planning. What you now fully understand and why this insight matters is that Tuesday's inflation data marks the beginning of a permanent transformation in American economic life, where trade policy has created irreversible changes in the cost structure facing every American family. The apparent moderation in current inflation statistics masks the early stages of a price adjustment that will likely accelerate throughout 2025 and beyond. The next phase of this transformation will likely intensify regardless of policy adjustments, because the underlying cost structures created by tariff policies cannot be easily reversed without significant economic disruption.
Well, President Trump posted to Truth Social announcing a new round of tariff hikes targeting 6 additional countries.
American families are entering an era where trade policy has become the primary driver of household budget pressure, fundamentally altering the relationship between political decisions and family economic security. Stay alert for what happens next, because if trade-driven inflation becomes embedded in American price structures, it will force permanent changes in consumption patterns and living standards that could reshape American society in ways that extend far beyond traditional economic policy discussions. The next big story that you missed today is how the Federal Reserve just revealed they're completely trapped by Trump's tariff war, exposing a central bank that's lost control of monetary policy and may be forced to choose between saving the economy or destroying the dollar. Before we get started on that, make sure to subscribe. The monetary policy crisis you've been sensing reached a breaking point Wednesday when the Federal Reserve's latest decision exposed an institution grappling with the reality that traditional central banking tools have become ineffective against politically driven economic disruption. What appears to be a routine decision to hold rates steady at 4.25 to 4.5% actually represents the public acknowledgement that America's central bank has lost its ability to guide the economy. The Federal Open Market Committee's statement cited elevated uncertainty about the economic outlook as justification for maintaining current rates. But this bland language conceals a more dramatic reality. The Fed has become a passenger in an economy increasingly driven by tariff policies that render traditional monetary tools useless. For the first time in modern Fed history, interest rate adjustments cannot effectively address the primary economic challenges facing the nation. The institution that successfully navigated the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, and decades of economic turbulence now confronts something entirely different. unemployment, systematic economic disruption caused by trade policies that create simultaneous inflationary and deflationary pressures that cannot be resolved through conventional monetary policy. Chairman Jerome Powell's latest comments revealed the depth of this institutional crisis, acknowledging that tariffs will push up prices and weigh on economic activity, while admitting that the effects depend on ultimate tariff levels that change frequently based on political rather than economic considerations. This represents a fundamental breakdown in the Fed's traditional role as the primary steward of American economic stability. By understanding what's really happening inside the Federal Reserve, you're witnessing the potential obsolescence of central banking as traditionally practiced, with implications that extend far beyond monetary policy into the fundamental governance of the American economy. The institutional paralysis you now recognize has created perfect conditions for what monetary economists are calling the central bank impossibility theorem. A situation where every available policy tool creates outcomes that undermine the Fed's dual mandate of price stability and maximum employment. Throughout 2025, the Federal Reserve has been caught in an unprecedented bind that challenges the basic assumptions underlying modern central banking. Traditional monetary policy operates by influencing demand through interest rate changes, but tariff-driven inflation stems from supply-side disruptions that cannot be addressed through demand management. Cutting rates to support employment could worsen inflation, while raising rates to combat price increases could accelerate economic decline. The Fed's traditional toolkit assumes that inflation and unemployment move in predictable relationships that can be managed through careful interest rate adjustments. But tariff-driven economic disruption creates stagflationary conditions where inflation and unemployment can rise simultaneously, breaking the fundamental economic relationships that have guided monetary policy for decades. Market participants have begun questioning the Fed's relevance in an economy where trade policy has become the primary driver of both inflation and employment outcomes. Bond traders now pay more attention to Trump's trade announcements than Fed communications, while currency markets show increasing volatility that reflects uncertainty about the central bank's ability to influence economic outcomes. The international dimension adds another layer of complexity, as foreign central banks struggle to understand how to interact with a Federal Reserve that has effectively acknowledged its diminished influence over American economic conditions. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency depends on confidence in Fed competence, but that confidence is being systematically undermined by the institution's public admission of policy limitations. You've now uncovered how the world's most powerful central bank has become trapped by political decisions it cannot influence, creating conditions for a monetary policy crisis that could reshape global finance. The critical moment you've been anticipating crystallized during Wednesday's FOMC statement release, when carefully parsed language revealed that the Federal Reserve has essentially admitted it cannot effectively manage an economy subject to constant trade policy disruption, marking a historic breakdown in central bank authority. The decision to hold rates unchanged appeared routine, but the accompanying statement exposed deeper institutional crisis. The phrase, "uncertainty about the economic outlook remains elevated," represents unprecedented Fed acknowledgement that external political decisions have rendered traditional economic forecasting ineffective. Central banks depend on predictability to function, but tariff policies change too frequently and dramatically for conventional monetary planning. Perhaps most significantly, two Fed board members dissented from the rate decision for the first time in over 30 years, with both Trump appointees arguing for immediate rate cuts despite ongoing inflation concerns. This internal division reflects the impossible position facing Fed officials, who must balance traditional economic indicators against political pressure from an administration that demands monetary accommodation regardless of inflationary consequences. Powell's post-meeting comments revealed the depth of the Fed's dilemma. His admission that tariff effects depend on the ultimate level of tariffs, which have frequently shifted, essentially acknowledges that monetary policy cannot be effectively calibrated when the primary driver of economic conditions changes based on daily political calculations rather than economic fundamentals. The market reaction exposed how thoroughly investors have lost confidence in Fed guidance. Rather than responding to the central bank's communications, traders immediately focused on Trump's social media posts demanding 3% rate cuts, illustrating how political pressure has supplanted economic analysis in monetary policy expectations. The international implications became clear as European and Asian central banks struggled to coordinate policy with a Federal Reserve that can no longer provide reliable guidance about American economic conditions. The Bank of Japan specifically noted concerns about dollar stability given Fed uncertainty, while the European Central Bank privately expressed concerns about coordinating with an institution facing unprecedented political pressure. What you're witnessing is the moment when the world's most important central bank effectively admitted it has lost control of the economic variables it was created to manage. creating conditions for a global monetary crisis. The aftershock from Wednesday's Fed admission has triggered emergency responses across global financial institutions that reveal just how dependent the international monetary system has become on Federal Reserve competence and credibility, with implications extending far beyond American borders. Within hours of the FOMC statement, foreign exchange markets began showing unusual volatility as traders struggled to price the dollar without reliable Fed guidance about future American economic conditions. Currency analysts noted that traditional models for predicting Fed behavior have become useless when political pressure overrides economic indicators in monetary policy decisions. International central banks began implementing contingency plans for managing their own economies without reliable American monetary leadership. The Bank of England activated enhanced monitoring systems for potential dollar instability, while the People's Bank of China accelerated development of alternative reserve currency mechanisms that reduce dependence on Fed policy coordination. Perhaps most significantly, major international corporations began restructuring their financial operations to reduce exposure to dollar-denominated assets and Fed policy uncertainty. European multinationals announced plans to increase euro-denominated cash holdings, while Asian companies accelerated development of regional payment systems that bypass traditional dollar-based international finance. The credit rating agencies' response was swift and concerning for American financial credibility. Both Moody's and S&P announced enhanced monitoring of American sovereign debt, noting that central bank policy uncertainty creates new categories of risk that traditional models had not anticipated. You now understand what global financial markets are struggling to process. The Federal Reserve's loss of policy effectiveness represents a fundamental threat to the international monetary system that has defined global finance since World War II. The unresolved monetary crisis you've tracked through the Fed's policy paralysis reveals a truth that most observers are missing. This represents more than temporary central bank uncertainty, but rather the potential end of the post-war international monetary system based on Federal Reserve leadership and dollar dominance. What you're witnessing is the emergence of post-Fed economics, a scenario where traditional monetary policy becomes ineffective due to political interference, forcing fundamental changes in how economies are managed and international finance is conducted. If the Federal Reserve cannot reliably influence American economic conditions, it calls into question the entire framework of central bank independence that has defined modern economics. The timeline for international monetary adjustment could accelerate rapidly if Fed credibility continues deteriorating. Alternative reserve currencies, regional payment systems, and decentralized financial mechanisms that were previously theoretical possibilities could become practical necessities if dollar stability becomes dependent on unpredictable political decisions rather than economic fundamentals. For the global economy, Fed policy uncertainty represents an existential threat to the stability that has enabled international trade and investment for decades. If the world's primary reserve currency becomes subject to political rather than economic management, it could trigger the fragmentation of global finance into competing regional systems. What you now fully understand and why this insight matters is that Wednesday's Fed decision marks a potential turning point in global economic history, where the institution that has anchored international finance for nearly a century has acknowledged its inability to manage the economic forces that matter most. The implications extend far beyond American monetary policy into the fundamental structure of international economic relationships. Stay alert for what happens next. Because if the Federal Reserve cannot regain control of American monetary conditions, it will force the international community to develop alternative financial systems that could permanently diminish American economic influence worldwide. The next big story that you missed today is how America's labor market just collapsed in ways that government statistics are desperately trying to hide, revealing that Trump's trade war has triggered the steepest employment decline since 2008, while officials manipulate data to maintain the illusion of economic strength. The employment catastrophe you've been sensing finally became undeniable in last week's Bureau of Labor Statistics report, where carefully buried revisions revealed that the American job market has been in freefall for months, while officials have systematically concealed the true scope of economic deterioration. What appeared to be modest job growth has actually been a coordinated statistical deception, hiding the worst employment collapse since the Great Recession. The headline figure of 73,000 jobs added in July initially seemed disappointing but manageable until economists discovered that the BLS had simultaneously erased 258,000 previously reported jobs from May and June through routine revisions. This means the American economy has effectively been losing jobs for 3 consecutive months, while government statisticians maintained the fiction of continued employment growth. The mathematical reality is stark. When combining July's weak performance with the massive prior month revisions, the U.S. economy has averaged just 35,000 jobs per month over the past quarter. Excluding healthcare sector hiring, the broader economy has actually shed more jobs than it has created during this period. The unemployment rate has remained artificially suppressed at 4.2%, not because of job growth, but because the Trump administration's immigration policies have shrunk the overall labor force. When people stop looking for work because opportunities don't exist, they disappear from unemployment statistics, while the underlying economic reality continues deteriorating. By understanding what's really happening in America's job market, you're witnessing the moment when trade policy stopped being an abstract political discussion and became a direct threat to American workers' livelihoods. The statistical manipulation you now recognize has created perfect conditions for what labor economists are calling the Great Employment Illusion, a scenario where government data creates false confidence about job market health, while the underlying economic reality shows systematic employment destruction. Throughout the summer of 2025, American employers have been implementing stealth workforce reduction, cutting positions through attrition, reduced hours, and hiring freezes rather than mass layoffs that would generate negative headlines. This approach has allowed companies to manage tariff-induced cost pressures while maintaining public perception of economic stability. The sector-by-sector breakdown reveals systematic employment pressure. Manufacturing jobs have declined by 10,000 year-over-year as companies struggle with steel, aluminum, and automotive tariffs. Construction employment has stagnated as higher material costs reduce project viability. Even service sectors are showing strain as reduced consumer spending power affects demand. Perhaps most concerning is the emergence of employment quality degradation, a shift from full-time positions with benefits toward part-time and gig work. This transition allows companies to maintain nominal employment levels while reducing labor costs, creating employment statistics that overstate actual economic security. You've now uncovered how employment statistics have become tools of economic propaganda rather than accurate measures of labor market health, creating false confidence that masks the early stages of systemic job market collapse. The critical revelation you've been anticipating emerged in last Friday's employment report, when the Bureau of Labor Statistics released data that didn't just disappoint expectations, but exposed the sophisticated statistical manipulation that has been concealing a labor market in systematic collapse for months. The initial focus on July's weak 73,000 job gain obscured the more devastating revelation buried in the report's revisions section. The BLS quietly announced that previously reported job gains for May and June had been reduced by 258,000 positions, effectively erasing nearly 250,000 jobs that officials had claimed were created during the supposed economic recovery. This revision represents more than statistical adjustment. It reveals a pattern of systematic overestimation that suggests either institutional incompetence or deliberate manipulation of employment data. When combined with July's weak performance, the 3-month average employment growth has fallen to just 35,000 positions per month, far below the 150,000 needed to maintain stable unemployment rates. The unemployment rate's persistence at 4.2%, despite collapsing job creation, exposed the most troubling aspect of current labor market dynamics. This apparent stability reflects not employment strength, but rather the artificial contraction of the labor force through immigration enforcement. When potential workers are removed from the country or discouraged from seeking employment, unemployment rates can remain low even as job opportunities disappear. President Trump's response proved equally revealing, as he fired the top BLS official responsible for employment statistics while claiming without evidence that the numbers had been manipulated. This unprecedented political interference in economic data collection suggests an administration more concerned with controlling statistical narratives than addressing underlying economic problems. Corporate earnings reports released simultaneously provided additional confirmation of labor market stress. Companies across multiple sectors reported reduced hiring plans and workforce restructuring designed to manage rising costs from tariff policies. What you're witnessing is the moment when statistical manipulation can no longer conceal the real-world impact of trade policies that are systematically destroying American employment opportunities while creating the illusion of economic strength. The aftershock from Friday's employment revelation has triggered unprecedented responses across American business and policy circles that expose just how dependent economic confidence has become on manipulated statistics rather than underlying economic reality. quickly. Within hours of the BLS data release, major corporations began implementing contingency plans that had been developed in anticipation of acknowledged labor market weakness. Retail chains announced reduced holiday hiring plans, while manufacturing companies accelerated automation investments to reduce dependence on human labor. Perhaps most significantly, international observers began questioning the reliability of American economic statistics more broadly. European and Asian central banks activated enhanced monitoring systems for U.S. economic conditions, while international investors increased demands for independent verification of American economic data. Corporate America's response exposed the gap between public optimism and private preparation for economic difficulty. CEO confidence measures fell to recessionary levels as business leaders implemented cost-cutting measures while maintaining public statements about economic strength. You now understand what policymakers are desperately trying to manage: the collapse of statistical credibility that could trigger broader questioning of American economic strength, potentially accelerating economic problems that statistical manipulation was designed to conceal. The unresolved employment crisis you've tracked through manipulated statistics reveals a truth that most observers are missing. This represents the emergence of a post-statistical economy where traditional economic measurement becomes politically compromised, potentially triggering permanent changes in how economic performance is evaluated and trusted. What you're witnessing is the birth of statistical authoritarianism, a system where economic data serves political narrative requirements rather than analytical accuracy, undermining the information infrastructure that modern economies require for efficient resource allocation. If employment statistics become propaganda tools, it corrupts the decision-making processes of businesses and investors who depend on reliable information. For American economic competitiveness, the loss of statistical credibility represents a potentially devastating blow to the institutional infrastructure that supports advanced economic development. If businesses and investors cannot trust government economic data, it increases the cost and uncertainty of economic planning in ways that could permanently disadvantage American commerce. What you now fully understand and why this insight matters is that Friday's employment report represents a fundamental breakdown in the statistical systems that modern economies require to function effectively. The combination of underlying economic weakness and statistical manipulation creates a dangerous dynamic that could accelerate economic problems while preventing effective policy responses. Stay alert for what happens next, because if American economic statistics become unreliable due to political interference, it will force businesses and investors to develop alternative information systems that could permanently reduce confidence in American economic institutions. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe to our channel.